Hi everyone, my name is Melodie Hicks, and I'm a nurse and a nurse educator from Montreal. I teach at Vanier College in Saint-Laurent. I'm going to switch things up a little bit because I obviously bring a very different perspective and perhaps a different focus to the conversation that we're having here today. I very much see us all in partnership, and I think it's really fitting that I follow Claude, whose company was so very much involved in getting the antiretrovirals to Africa, which is really where my story begins, but certainly does not end. We're to talk about adversity, and I believe that adversity has now become my middle name because everything I have tried to do has not always been met with the same enthusiasm that I've brought to the table, and perhaps some of you have experienced that sometimes with some of the ideas that you've tried to move forward. My story, as I say, begins here in Malawi, sub-Saharan Africa, which I visited in 2008 and really was a game changer for what I'm doing today. Interesting enough, we still don't really consider it a chronic illness in Malawi. There's still way too many deaths every year, and some of the adversity that's faced in that country is not the availability of the drugs, but it's the accessibility to those medications, which is something in my small way I'm trying to perhaps improve upon. Don't get me wrong, in 2008, the life expectancy for women was 39 years old. And that was because of the AIDS epidemic. You can see the difference today. So there has been an incredible increase in life expectancy in just 6 years, which is really kind of mind-boggling. This is how I feel some days, and perhaps you can relate to that as well. In 2008, I spent a lot of time with healthcare professionals, healthcare providers, and educators, and I sort of formulated an idea that I would like to establish a nursing education program abroad. I wanted to introduce my graduating students to health in a more global context. And as I say, I was so keen. I came back, I was all excited, and my excitement was met with a lot of people who were quite reticent and didn't quite see my vision or what I was trying to do. And some of those questions were things like this, how could Canadian students possibly gain anything or learn anything in a country that was so resource poor? And I guess that's how you look at what nursing is. Nursing is not all about, although medications are a massive part of what we do and we could not do our job without them, nursing is an art. It's about being able to connect with your patients. It's being able to assess and to rely on your own abilities. And frankly, there may be a big lack of resources, certainly physical material resources, but I actually looked at it as an incredible richness. There are 16 million people in Malawi alone that would probably fit into the province of Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. So what we lacked in material resources, I certainly felt it made up for in human resources. Funding is an ongoing problem. I had a lot of administrators saying, how can you introduce a program at a college level that's so expensive? Our students can't afford that kind of thing. So adversity, a stumbling block, but certainly not something that kept me from moving forward. And what we've done is an awful lot of fundraising. Fundraising makes students feel invested. There's nothing wrong with working hard for something that you value. And I think, again, that is something we can all relate to. However, when fundraising takes away from what the primary focus is, which is education, that becomes a problem. So it's always finding that balance. How much do you burden the students with fundraising? And then, of course, how much then do they, value the experience? I also need to prepare these students to parachute into a developing country. Their training has been here in Canada. We have a very different, not a different focus because, the human focus, patient focus is always the same. But certainly there is some preparation that needs to be done ahead of time before they find themselves in this environment. And that also burdens a graduating student who's already got a lot on their plate. And lastly, sustainability. I'm a firm believer that if our students here in Canada are going to get an international experience and grow, which they do, then that needs to be reciprocated. It is not fair that our students go abroad and gain this global perspective and see how their education can be applied throughout the world, and that we don't allow the students in Malawi to have that same experience. And again, I entered into a partnership in 2010, signed this agreement saying, yes, 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 of course we'll reciprocate, only to find out that that wasn't quite so easy to do. And people who know me know that I am a little bit like that. I plow ahead and perhaps don't always have all my T's crossed and all my I's dotted. So 3 years later, it did take us 3 years, last January, we finally did receive our first 2 nursing students from Malawi. We hope we've now set a precedent with immigration, and that now has opened the door for us a little bit. So this is some of the adversity that I've faced personally, but certainly adversity on the receiving end for my patients in Malawi, I could spend a whole day talking to you about, because we have our issues here, but there is simply no comparison to what people are faced with on a daily basis in developing countries. I've learned some lessons. I've learned that adversity is something that certainly requires perseverance and persistence. I have been accused of being a bit like a dog with a bone. And I believe patience, people will come around to your new ideas, just like your use of social media and so on. They will come around to those ideas, but they need to be given a little time to, to see things your way. Creativity, absolutely. But for me, the biggest factor that has moved my program forward is the development of partnerships, both here in Canada and abroad. And one of those partnerships is with Health Partners International of Canada, which many of your companies already contribute medications to. And it is through my partnership with HPIC that my students are able to have some of the tools that they do need in order to effect change in Malawi. To date, this is coming up our 5th year with this nursing exchange, and they've carried over $100,000 worth of medications, which at first are a bit of a pain. It takes their second piece of luggage. Young people like to bring the comforts of home, but I think that's part of the exercise. They have to reduce their own personal possessions to one bag, and the second bag is humanitarian aid. It's the physician travel packs containing the medications, which they don't value on the way there, believe me. But the first time we do a mobile clinic, and they actually take those medications out of the box and single-handedly save lives. I think the true value of those drugs that they've carried and lugged halfway around the world really becomes very obvious. And I think that's a lesson they come home here to Canada with, that drugs are not to be taken for granted, and that we are so incredibly fortunate for what we have to offer our clients on a daily basis. Mobile clinics, I have this whole thing that we don't have our patients come to us in Malawi. We have to take care to them. And so a lot of what we do is to try and deal with that accessibility issue that I was talking about. We actually go to our clients. And this is the scene. When we arrive, there are hundreds of people who line up and sometimes have not had health care for 6-8 months because of the impassivity of the roads in the rainy season. These are just images of my students. The value of these international exchanges is something that finally the Canadian government and now the private sector is beginning to see is what our students need here in Canada. It needs to be part of their education. We need to internationalize our students. They need to understand what the needs are abroad, and that's no matter whether they become a nurse or they start to work in any of your companies. They need to have that global perspective. And how are we going to get that and give that to them? It's very difficult to teach that in a classroom setting. So immersion in another culture is one of the ways that research has shown is the most effective way for these students to pick up the skill sets. It's who's going to pick up the bill. And I did have a question. I don't know if it got embedded in my presentation, but the proposal that's on the table right now is that the government start to support these initiatives, and that the private sector who will be receiving these students who are being educated also shoulder some of that burden. I did have a question. I don't know where it is in my presentation, but I'd love to know how you feel about that, whether you feel, you know, who does the burden for these type of experiences lie on. 10%, 3% of Canadian students are receiving any kind of formal international experience. And yet I think you're all wanting them to have that perspective when they come to you. So I think it's an interesting question perhaps to leave you with, because I believe I did hear some music there. A teacher is never short-winded, but I am learning. There's my group there. I actually didn't do too badly. There you go. So I didn't have that clicker question. Could I have a show of hands? Do you believe that there should be some way to enable us to internationalize our colleges and our students? Public educations don't have the funding. Should governments and private sector be assisting us with that? If you believe so, would you put a hand up? Well, that's really encouraging. I thank you for that.